The Siege of Coevorden was a siege that took place between the 26th of July to the 2nd of September 1592 during the 80 Years' War and the Anglo-Spanish War at the city of Coevorden by a Dutch and English force under overall command of Maurice of Nassau. The city was defended by Frederik van den Bergh, who had been commissioned for the defense by King Philip II of Spain. A Spanish relief force under Francisco Verdugo and Cristóbal de Mondragón attempted to relieve the Spanish garrison. However, a failed attack on the besiegers as well as desertions and disease meant the Spanish relief force had to retreat, leaving Coevorden to its fate. As a result, on the 2nd of September 1592, the garrison of Coevorden surrendered. Background: in 1591, Maurice of Orange, the Dutch Republic's military commander, had led a successful campaign, in which he had captured several important cities, culminating in the capture of Nijmegen in October that year. During that campaign he had also captured Delfzijl, meant Groningen, the capital of Drenthe, being stripped of its main transit port. The ultimate goal of Maurice was to take that city in 1591, but the defensiveness looked too strong. Therefore, in 1592, he began by besieging and taking Steenwijk so that Groningen would grow weaker. Maurice then wanted to move immediately to Coevorden, but the States General did not want this to proceed. The Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, although wounded from his unsuccessful campaign in northern France, had returned to the Netherlands, near Zeeland, and the States General wanted to recall Maurice there. However, the Republic's army, consisting of 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, was well complemented by the addition of newly recruited German mercenaries as well as the English army under Francis Vere, 14 companies of infantry and 5 troops of cavalry. Parma, convalescing from his wound at the same time, was in no fit condition to lead an army, and the army itself was not at full strength. Coevorden itself was an important 5-bastion fortress in the east of the country and lay between two large marshes, the Bourtonge swamp, which was 30 miles to the bay at Dollet, and the other spread as far as the Zuiderzee. The only hard ground was the road heading towards Coevorden on a natural barrier of sand half-mile wide. At the time, Coevorden was named as the third strongest fortress in Europe, designed and built by Francisco Spacioto, the architect of the famous citadel of Antwerp. The Spanish commander Francisco Verdugo had reported to Parma and the governor ad interim Ernst von Mansfeld the immense importance of Coevorden and claimed the city was far more important than any others that had been taken that year by the Anglo-Dutch. The Verdugo, having been positioned in Groenlo and prepared with the veteran Spanish general Cristóbal de Mondragón to launch a strike against any potential siege. Maurice in the meantime conducted training with the troops at Gwethorn, learning how to turn, advance, retreat and double the lines. Once the Spanish pressure in the east had relaxed on the 21st of July, the Anglo-Dutch army, with approval from States General, marched to Coevorden. Siege. On the 26th of July, Maurice's forces arrived at Coevorden and began the siege. The garrison had 1,000 veterans as well as 900 militia, all under the command of Frederik van den Bergh. Maurice put his cousin William Louis, Count of Nassau-Dillenburg, in charge of the siege, whilst he ventured to Oud-Marsum to counter any relief attempt by the Spanish. Meanwhile, Francis Vere did the same with some of the English troops and fell back to Doesburg on the IJssel River. William Louis ordered trenches to be dug towards the fortress and sconces to be built around the city. As a result, all the roads that were administered to the city was thus cut off from the outside. The siege lines around Coevorden was virtually complete except on the east part of city, which was marshy and no siege work could be done. Engineers and pioneers were sent to the city moat so that a cover trench could be made on the fortress. Digging began, and soon the trench itself was 4 to 5 feet deep and 12 feet wide. An attack by pioneers and soldiers on a village suburb was attempted whilst the siege lines got closer. However, the attack was repulsed by the garrison in the city, but determined they attacked again the next day and managed to occupy the suburb. On August 12, seeing no threat of relief, Maurice returned to the siege. Mining and sapping continued for the besiegers. The pioneers and engineers constructed dams that cut off the canal that fed the ditch lines, which were dug up to it, from which the water was drained. This resulted in the problem of lack of fresh water for the garrison in the city. Some of them thought it best that they should make terms with Maurice, but Bergh refused. He had the confidence that Francisco Verdugo, together with other Spanish commanders, would provide the relief of the city. By mid-August, wet weather had impeded operations further, but for the besieging force it was thought that it would impede any army of relief. However, after learning of the besiegers' fragile communication lines, the Verdugo and Mondragón's force marched from Grol with the relief force to Coevorden. By August 23, the veteran tertio regiments of Mondragón, Gonzaga, Mansfield and Bergh, a force of 5,000 men, had crossed the Rhine at Rheinberg. By the 3rd of September, Verdugo's force was within a league of the city at Mondragón, having reached within 10 miles of Coevorden. News reached Maurice of this force soon after and prepared for a confrontation with Verdugo, and as a result several forts were built in strategic places around the siege positions. The city was informed of the relief force by the distant lighting of the fires and torches. Part of Verreh's English army meanwhile had also heard of Verdugo's relief. They broke camp at Dusberg and immediately marched back to Coevorden. The Verdugo decided to launch a camisado, an attack on the camp at night, with the Spanish soldiers dressed in white shirts without their armor so that they couldn't be distinguished in the night. Just before daybreak, the Spanish assaulted one of the besiegers' camp, which was under Count Hohenlohe's command. Barely before the fight had begun, however, English soldiers under Vergh struck at the Spanish assault, ranging within cannon shot of the trenches just as some of the Dutch were falling back. Vergh, having arrived just in time, led an assault whilst the Spanish attacked, saving a critical situation. Count John of Nassau, writing to his father, said, "Vergh fought with the Spanish like a man. He came up half an hour after the fight began. Soon after the English arrived, the Dutch joined in on the assailants, who eventually at length were repulsed. The Dutch and English had suffered 50 casualties, including William Lewis, who was wounded in the abdomen, but the wound was not as serious as was first thought. The Verdugo, having been repulsed and having lost 300 men, then tried to enter into an open field pitched battle with Maurice. Maurice refused to be tempted there, and the sapping and mining continued, followed by a heavy bombardment. The Van den Bergh had to undermine a wall, and behind from it in desperation a new wall was built, which caused some surprise, but for the Dutch and English it had little effect. The Verdugo could not force his way past the tough Anglo-Dutch resistance. Disease was high among his troops, and had a high desertion rate meant that he could not make a further attempt to relieve the place. The Verdugo then tried to starve the surrounding area so as to make sure the town held out longer, but the besiegers, however, had ensured a sufficient supply of food and ammunition. The Verdugo and Mondragón could not attempt any further action conditions that could save Coevorden, and to save losses of his own troops he therefore ordered a retreat. When Van den Bergh noted that the relief force no longer attempted to relieve the city, he sent a drummer to Maurice with a request for negotiations of terms of surrender. Van den Bergh had prepared various conditions, most of which were granted, and thus Coevorden was surrendered to Maurice. Aftermath. The garrison was allowed to leave with full honours of war and could go wherever they wanted. Soon after, the victorious Anglo-Dutch marched in, but were too weak to enable any further sieges for the rest of the year. The army went into winter quarters, and news of the Duke of Parma's death was received in the camp. During the greater part of the winter, Vere shipped off companies which he had drilled and trained to serve under other commanders in France and Ireland. Still, there were 4,000 effective English and Scots troops in all of the Netherlands on the 1st of January 1593. After the conquests of Steenwijck and Coevorden by the States, Frisian's troops demanded that Groningen should be besieged. The army of Maurice moved on to Groningen, but the States General had decided otherwise, to press on to Gertrudenburg. The Frisians, as a sign of protest, sent no troops to the siege, but regardless, the Spanish garrison thus surrendered after a 3-month siege. Groningen fell finally on May 6, 1594, after a siege by Maurice and Vere. The whole period of these victories under Maurice took place in the era known as the 10 Glory Years. Bibliography. Black, Jeremy. European Warfare, 1494–1660. Warfare and History. Routledge. ISBN 9781134477081. Borman, Tracy. Sir Francis Vere in the Netherlands, 1589–1603, a re-evaluation of his career as Sergeant Major General of Elizabeth I's troops. University of Hull. Duffy, Christopher. Siege Warfare, The Fortress in the Early Modern World, 1494–1660, Volume 1 of Siege Warfare. Routledge. ISBN 9781136707875. Fissel, Mark Charles. English Warfare, 1511–1642, Warfare and History. London, UK. Routledge. ISBN 9780415214810. Jacques, Tony. Dictionary of Battles and Sieges. A Guide to 8,500 Battles from Antiquity through the 21st Century. Greenwood Press. ISBN 9780313335365. Leon, Fernando González de. The Road to Rocroi, Class, Culture and Command in the Spanish Army of Flanders, 1567–1659. Brill. ISBN 97804170827. McCaffrey, Wallace D. Elizabeth I War and Politics, 1588–1603. Princeton Paperbacks, Princeton University Press. ISBN 9780691036519. Markham, C.R. The Fighting Farish, Lives of Sir Francis Vere and Sir Horace Vere. Kessinger Publishing. ISBN 9781432549053. Naffy, William G. The Protestant Revolution, From Martin Luther to Martin Luther King, Jr. Random House. ISBN 9781446416891. The Van Nimwegen Oorlog, The Dutch Army and the Military Revolutions, 1588–1688, Volume 31 of Warfare in History Series. Boydell and Amp. Brewer. ISBN 9781843835752. Wernham, Richard Bruce. After the Armada, Elizabethan England and the Struggle for West and Europe, 1588–1595. Clarendon Press. ISBN 9780198227533. The Van der Herven, Marco. Exercise of Arms, Warfare in the Netherlands, 1568–1648, Volume 1. Brill. ISBN 9789004107274. External links: The Buffs, East Kent Regiment.